Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of the Forbidden City in 1720, watching as a young boy, maybe 12 years old, is dragged screaming toward a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of Beijing. His family follows behind, weeping but resigned, clutching the silver coins they've been paid for what they're about to allow. The boy doesn't understand what's happening to him yet, but he will soon learn that he's about to undergo one of history's most brutal rituals. A procedure so horrific that 1 in 3 children who endured it would never see another sunrise. You watch as the door closes behind him, sealing his fate. What happens next in that blood-stained room will transform him from a whole human being into something else entirely. A eunuch in service to the Qing Dynasty. But this isn't just about castration. What you're witnessing is the beginning of a systematic destruction of human dignity that lasted for centuries, hidden behind the golden walls of imperial palaces, while the world looked away. The screams that echo from that building carry with them secrets so dark, so twisted, that Chinese historians have spent centuries trying to bury them. These are the stories of boys who were mutilated in the name of imperial service, of men who lived their entire lives as neither fully male nor female, trapped in a twilight existence that served the paranoid fantasies of emperors who feared their own shadows. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of ancient Chinese customs. It's the story of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how desperation drives families to make unthinkable choices, and how thousands of human beings were systematically broken and rebuilt to serve a system that saw them as less than human. The eunuchs of the Qing Dynasty weren't just castrated men. They were the products of a machine designed to create the perfect servants through the most imperfect means imaginable. Let's begin with the boy we watched enter that building. His name was Liu Wei, though that name replaced by whatever designation his imperial masters chose to give him. He was born in a small village outside Beijing in 1708, the third son of a farmer whose crops had failed 3 years running. The previous winter had been brutal, so cold that even the wealthy merchants in Beijing spoke of the unprecedented freeze that killed livestock and destroyed food stores across northern China. Liu Wei's family faced the arithmetic of desperation that haunted countless Chinese families during the Qing Dynasty. They had 3 sons and barely enough food to keep one alive through the coming winter. The local magistrate had been making increasingly aggressive demands for tax payments, threatening to seize their small plot of land if the family couldn't produce silver they simply didn't have. Every option led to starvation, except one. The knife men who performed castrations would pay families in advance for promising boys, young enough to survive the procedure, old enough to be useful in palace service. The payment varied depending on the child's appearance and perceived intelligence, but even the smallest sum represented more money than Liu Wei's family had seen in years. It meant the difference between the entire family starving and at least some of them surviving to see spring. Liu Wei's father made the deal on a gray November morning, shaking hands with a man whose business card listed him simply as a specialist in imperial preparation. The euphemism fooled no one, but it allowed both parties to pretend they were engaged in something other than the sale of a child's manhood. The knife man examined Liu Wei like a farmer evaluating, checking his teeth, his reflexes, the clarity of his eyes. He noted that the boy was small for his age but healthy, with the kind of delicate features that palace supervisors preferred. The family was given 3 days to prepare Liu Wei for his transformation. These weren't days of celebration or even proper goodbye ceremonies. They were days of terrible waiting, during which everyone involved tried not to think about what was coming. Liu Wei's mother couldn't look at him directly. His father busied himself with unnecessary farm work, desperate to avoid conversations about the boy's fate. Liu Wei himself sensed something was wrong but couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what his family had arranged. On the appointed morning, the knife man arrived with 2 assistants and a wooden cart filled with supplies that Liu Wei couldn't identify, but that filled the air with the sharp smell of medicinal herbs and something else. Something metallic and ominous. The boy was told he was going to the capital to serve the emperor, that this was a great honor that would elevate his entire family's status. These weren't complete lies, but they weren't complete truths either. The building where Liu Wei was taken stood in a district of Beijing that specialized in preparing boys for palace service. It was one of dozens of similar establishments, each run by knife men who had learned their trade through years of apprenticeship and practice. These weren't doctors or trained surgeons. They were craftsmen who had developed expertise in a very specific and very brutal procedure. The room where castrations took place was designed for efficiency rather than comfort. A raised wooden table dominated the center, surrounded by braziers that kept metal instruments heated to cauterize wounds. Immediately, ropes and leather straps hung from the walls, ready to restrain boys who might struggle during the procedure. The floor was stained dark with decades of blood that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. Liu Wei was stripped naked and examined one final time to ensure he was healthy enough to survive what was about to happen. The knife man explained the procedure in matter-of-fact terms as if he were describing how to butcher a pig rather than mutilate a human child. The boy would be restrained on the table, his genitals would be removed with heated knives. The wounds would be immediately cauterized to prevent bleeding. If he survived the next 3 days without developing infection or bleeding to death, he would be ready for palace service. The procedure itself was horrifically simple. Liu Wei was strapped to the table so tightly that he couldn't move even his fingers. A wooden block was forced between his teeth to prevent him from biting his tongue. The knife man worked quickly. Speed was essential to minimize blood loss and shock. The heated blade removed everything in a matter of seconds, followed immediately by the application of red-hot iron to seal the wounds. The pain was beyond anything human language can adequately describe. Liu Wei's screams, muffled by the wooden block, filled the room until his voice gave out entirely. His body went into shock almost immediately, a natural defense mechanism that probably saved his life by rendering him unconscious during the worst of the ordeal. But consciousness returned eventually, bringing with it the full realization of what had been done to him. The recovery period was a test of survival that claimed roughly 1 in 3 boys who underwent the procedure. Liu Wei was moved to a small, windowless room where he lay on a thin mat, unable to move without excruciating pain. The knife man's assistants checked on him regularly, looking for signs of infection, fever, or excessive bleeding. They administered herbal medicines that were supposed to promote healing, though their effectiveness was questionable at best. For 3 days, Liu Wei existed in a twilight state between life and death. His body fought fever and infection while his mind struggled to process the trauma of what had happened. He couldn't eat solid food. The shock and pain made swallowing difficult. He survived on thin broths and herbal teas that his caretakers forced down his throat. Sleep came in brief, nightmare-filled intervals that provided little rest and no escape from the reality of his situation. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical trauma. Liu Wei had to confront the fact that he was no longer the same person who had entered the building 3 days earlier. His body had been fundamentally altered in ways that would affect every aspect of his future life. He would never father children, never experience physical intimacy as nature intended, never fully mature into the man he might have become. But Liu Wei was one of the fortunate ones. He survived. On the 4th day, when it became clear that he would live, the knife man's assistants began preparing him for the next phase of his transformation. They taught him how to care for his wounds, how to manage the ongoing discomfort, and most importantly, how to hide his pain from the palace officials who would soon evaluate his suitability for service. The healing process took weeks, during which Liu Wei remained in the knife man's establishment with dozens of other boys in various stages of recovery. Some had arrived that morning and lay moaning on their mats, beginning their own journeys through hell. Others had been there for weeks and were preparing to leave for palace service. The older boys taught the newer ones what to expect: how to walk without showing pain, how to speak without revealing the trauma they had endured, how to present themselves as eager and grateful servants, rather than the broken children they actually were. Liu Wei learned that his castration was only the beginning of his transformation. The palace system required more than just the removal of his manhood. It demanded the complete reconstruction of his identity. He would be given a new name, new clothes, new loyalties. His past as a farmer's son would be erased as thoroughly as his capacity for normal sexual function. He would become a creature of the imperial court, dependent on its whims for survival, forever separated from the world of whole men by the violence that had been done to his body. The other boys in recovery came from similar backgrounds, rural families driven by poverty and desperation to make choices no parent should ever have to make. They shared stories of failed harvests, unpaid taxes, and parents who wept as they signed contracts with the knife men. Some boys claimed their families had been honored to provide a son for imperial service. But these were the lies children tell themselves to make unbearable realities seem bearable. As Liu Wei's wounds slowly healed, he began to understand the economics of the system that had. The knife men were businessmen who had identified a profitable niche, serving the palace's constant need for eunuch servants. They maintained relationships with rural families who might be willing to sell sons, negotiated prices based on the boys' perceived value, and delivered finished products to palace officials who evaluated each castrated child for potential roles in imperial service. The palace itself was the ultimate destination for all this suffering. A vast complex where thousands of eunuchs served in various capacities, from lowly servants who cleaned floors to powerful administrators who managed imperial finances. The system created its own hierarchy of the mutilated, where boys who survived castration could potentially rise to positions of significant power and influence, but only by embracing their role in perpetuating the same system that had destroyed them. Liu Wei spent his final days at the knife man's establishment, learning the basic protocols of palace service. He was taught how to walk with small, quick steps that palace officials preferred from their eunuch servants. He learned the proper way to bow, to speak only when spoken to, and to arrange his facial expression in the neutral mask that conveyed respectful attention without any hint of independent thought or emotion. Most importantly, he was taught to be grateful. The knife men and their assistants repeatedly emphasized how fortunate Liu Wei was to have this opportunity for advancement. They spoke of eunuchs who had risen to become confidants of emperors, who had accumulated vast wealth and power, who had lived in luxury unimaginable to common farmers. They never mentioned the thousands who had died in service, the countless eunuchs who had lived and died as anonymous servants, or the psychological price of a lifetime spent as something less than a complete human being. On a cold morning in early spring, Liu Wei was loaded into a cart with 5 other newly castrated boys and transported to the Forbidden City for the first time. As the massive walls came into view, he felt a mixture of terror and awe that would characterize his relationship with imperial power for the rest of his life. The palace that rose before him was beautiful beyond anything he had ever imagined, but it was also the heart of a system that had mutilated him and thousands like him in service of maintaining its own splendor. The gates of the Forbidden City swallowed Liu Wei like the mouth of some enormous beast, and as they closed behind him, his transformation from human being to imperial property was complete. What awaited him beyond those walls would test not just his ability to survive, but his capacity to maintain any sense of his own humanity in a world designed to strip it away piece by piece. But this is only the beginning of Liu Wei's story, and the horrors he would witness and endure in imperial service make his castration seem almost merciful by comparison. The true secrets of the Qing Dynasty Eunuchs lay not in the violence used to create them, but in the systematic dehumanization that followed. A process so thoroughly designed to break human spirits that it created an entire class of people who existed in the shadows between life and death, serving masters who saw them as less than human, while wielding power that common people could never dream of achieving. The entrance examination for new eunuchs was conducted in a courtyard that had witnessed this same ritual thousands of times before. Liu Wei and the other boys were made to stand in a line while palace officials evaluated their potential usefulness. These men moved between the castrated children like buyers at a livestock market, checking posture, testing reflexes, and asking questions designed to reveal intelligence and temperament. The head examiner was a eunuch himself, a man named Director Chen, who had undergone the same procedure 30 years earlier and had risen through the palace hierarchy to become one of the most powerful figures in the imperial household. His own castration scars were hidden beneath silk robes, but his voice carried the high, distinctive pitch that marked all men who had been cut before puberty. When he looked at Liu Wei, his eyes held no compassion for what the boy had endured. Instead, they calculated potential value with the cold precision of someone who had learned to see human suffering as merely another administrative detail. Director Chen's examination was thorough and humiliating. He forced Liu Wei to remove his clothes so that the healing wounds could be inspected for signs of proper procedure and recovery. He tested the boy's reading ability by having him recite passages from classical texts. He evaluated Liu Wei's capacity for physical labor by ordering him to carry heavy objects around the courtyard until his legs shook with exhaustion. Most disturbingly, he assessed the boy's psychological condition by asking questions designed to reveal whether Liu Wei still thought of himself as a complete person or had begun to accept his new status as imperial property. The questions were crafted with diabolical cleverness. Director Chen asked Liu Wei what he missed most about his former life, watching carefully for signs that the boy still mourned his lost manhood. He inquired about Liu Wei's family, testing whether the child harbored resentment about being sold or had begun to see his castration as a beneficial sacrifice. He posed hypothetical scenarios about loyalty and obedience, searching for any hint that Liu Wei might retain enough independence of spirit to cause problems in palace service. Liu Wei had been coached by the knife men about how to answer such questions, but the reality of facing this examination was far more challenging than any preparation could address. He struggled to find responses that would satisfy Director Chen while not completely betraying his own sense of identity. When asked what he hoped to achieve in palace service, Liu Wei recited the expected phrases about honor and gratitude, but his voice trembled with the strain of speaking words that felt like swallowing poison. The other boys in his group handled the examination differently. One child, perhaps a year younger than Liu Wei, had clearly been broken more completely by his castration. He answered every question with enthusiastic servility, praising the wisdom of the emperor and expressing joy at being chosen for palace service. His performance was so convincing that Director Chen smiled with approval, but Liu Wei recognized the hollow look in the younger boy's eyes. The expression of someone whose spirit had been so thoroughly crushed that compliance had become his only survival. Another boy maintained a defiant silence that Director Chen found intriguing rather than troublesome. This child, older and larger than the others, bore his castration wounds like battle scars and met the examiner's gaze with barely concealed hatred. Rather than rejecting him for insolence, Director Chen marked him for special training, recognizing that controlled anger could be useful in certain palace roles where intimidation was more valuable than submission. After hours of examination, the boys were divided into categories based on their perceived potential. Liu Wei found himself assigned to the middle tier, intelligent enough for administrative training, but not broken enough for immediate placement in positions requiring absolute obedience. This classification would determine every aspect of his future life, from the dormitory where he would sleep to the type of work he would be trained to perform. The dormitory assigned to Liu Wei was a long, narrow building that housed 40 newly castrated boys in various stages of training. The older residents had been there for months, learning the complex protocols of palace service while their bodies and minds adapted to their new circumstances. They moved through the space with the careful precision of people who had learned that any mistake could result in severe punishment. But their eyes held the distant quality of those who had retreated deep inside themselves to survive. The sleeping arrangements reflected the palace's systematic approach to dehumanization. Each boy was assigned a narrow wooden platform, barely wide enough for his body, with thin mats that provided minimal comfort against the hard surface. Personal possessions were forbidden except for the identical sets of gray clothing that marked them as property of the imperial household. Privacy was impossible in a room designed to ensure that every unit could be observed at all times by the supervisors who prowled the dormitory at regular intervals. The daily routine began before dawn with the sound of wooden clappers that jarred the boys from whatever fitful sleep they had managed. They had exactly 10 minutes to dress, wash their faces in the cold water provided in ceramic basins, and arrange their sleeping areas according to precise. Any deviation from these requirements resulted in punishment that ranged from reduced food rations to public beatings that served as examples for the other boys. Breakfast consisted of thin rice porridge supplemented with pickled vegetables that provided minimal nutrition, but enough calories to sustain basic function. The boys ate in silence, forbidden to speak during meals or to make eye contact with their supervisors. This enforced isolation was designed to prevent the formation of friendships or alliances that might provide emotional support and potentially lead to resistance against palace authority. The morning hours were devoted to physical conditioning, designed to prepare the boys for various types of palace service. Those destined for heavy labor were required to carry increasingly heavy loads around the courtyard until their muscles adapted to the demands. Boys selected for domestic service practiced the intricate movements required for proper food presentation, tea preparation, and room maintenance. The most intelligent were taught basic literacy and arithmetic skills that would be necessary for administrative roles. Liu Wei found himself in the administrative training group, which meant hours spent copying classical text in the precise calligraphy style preferred by. The work was mentally exhausting and physically demanding, requiring him to maintain perfect posture while forming thousands of identical characters with brushes that seemed designed to cramp his hands. Mistakes were harshly punished, not just with physical beatings, but with the humiliation of having his work displayed as an example of inadequate effort. The afternoon sessions focused on palace protocol and etiquette. The boys learned the hundreds of specific behaviors required for different situations they might encounter in imperial service. They practiced the various types of bows appropriate for different ranks of officials, memorized the correct phrases for addressing superiors, and rehearsed the intricate procedures for everything from serving tea to announcing visitors. These lessons were taught by senior eunuchs who had spent decades in palace service and had internalized every aspect of the system that had consumed them. They showed no mercy for mistakes or confusion, viewing the new boys not as children recovering from traumatic surgery, but as raw materials that needed to be shaped into useful tools. Their teaching methods relied heavily on shame and physical punishment, creating an atmosphere of constant fear that made learning even simple tasks feel like life-or-death challenges. The most disturbing aspect of the training was how it systematically erased the boys' individual identities and replaced them with manufactured personalities designed to serve imperial needs. Liu Wei was forced to practice speaking in the high, soft tones that palace officials expected from their eunuch servants. He learned to walk with small, quick steps that conveyed humility and subservience. Most painfully, he was taught to smile with apparent gratitude when receiving orders, even when those orders involved tasks that were degrading or dangerous. The psychological conditioning extended beyond mere behavior modification. The boys were subjected to daily lectures about their good fortune in being selected for palace service, about the honor of serving the emperor, and about their duty to be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the glory of the dynasty. These sessions were designed to convince the castrated children that their mutilation had been a blessing rather than a trauma, that their families had made a wise decision in selling them, and that their future happiness depended entirely on their willingness to embrace their new identities as imperial property. Liu Wei struggled against this conditioning more than some of his dormitory companions, but less than others. Part of him recognized the propaganda for what it was, but another part desperately wanted to believe that his suffering had some greater purpose. The alternative, accepting that he had been mutilated simply to create a more convenient servant, was too painful to acknowledge directly. Those who resisted their conditioning faced harsh lessons meant to silence. One boy, unable to contain grief over what had been taken from him, was publicly shamed. paraded before others as a warning, while lessons on loyalty echoed around him. Another, after trying to contact his family, was punished so severely he required days to recover, then made to write a formal vow of renewed obedience. These punishments were designed not just to modify individual behavior, but to create a climate of terror that would prevent collective resistance. The boys learned to monitor each other for signs of dissatisfaction or rebellion, understanding that their own survival might depend on reporting potential problems to their supervisors. This system of mutual surveillance destroyed trust and prevented the formation of genuine relationships that might have provided emotional support during the most difficult aspects of their training. As weeks turned into months, Liu Wei watched his fellow trainees transform in some, like the youngest boy from his examination group, embraced their new identities with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine but felt hollow to those who knew them. They spoke constantly of their gratitude for being chosen, their excitement about serving the emperor, and their determination to excel in whatever roles they were assigned. Their transformation was so complete that they seemed to have forgotten they had ever been anything other than eunuch servants. Others retreated into themselves so completely that they became like living ghosts, present in body, but absent in spirit. These boys performed their duties with mechanical precision but showed no emotion, curiosity, or individual personality. They had learned to survive by becoming empty vessels that could be filled with whatever the palace required, but the cost of this survival strategy was the complete abandonment of their own humanity. A third group, including Liu Wei himself, tried to find a middle path between complete submission and dangerous resistance. They learned to perform the required behaviors while maintaining some secret sense of their original selves. This approach was perhaps the most psychologically difficult, requiring them to live constantly divided lives where their outer compliance masked inner rebellion that could never be safely expressed. The training culminated in a final examination that would determine each boy's specific assignment within the palace hierarchy. This test was even more comprehensive than the initial evaluation, assessing not just the skills the boys had learned, but their psychological adaptation to their new circumstances. Palace officials interviewed each trainee extensively, looking for signs of lingering resentment, inappropriate attachment to their former lives, or insufficient gratitude for their current situation. Liu Wei's final examination lasted an entire day and covered every aspect of his training. He was required to demonstrate his calligraphy skills by copying complex documents without error, to recite palace protocols from memory, and to perform various service tasks under the scrutiny of senior officials. But the most challenging part was the psychological evaluation, where he had to convince his examiners that he had genuinely accepted his new identity while avoiding the appearance of false enthusiasm that might suggest underlying resistance. The results of these examinations would determine whether the boys were assigned to positions of relative comfort and potential advancement, or condemned to lives of anonymous drudgery in the palace's lower levels. For Liu Wei and his companions, everything they had endured over the past months had been preparation for this moment, when their futures would be decided by men who saw them not as human beings, but as investments that needed to be allocated efficiently. The results came 3 days later, delivered by a senior eunuch whose silk robes rustled like whispers of doom as he read from an ornate scroll. Liu Wei had been assigned to the Imperial Archives, a position that placed him in the middle tier of palace hierarchy, neither elevated to positions of real influence nor condemned to the grinding manual labor that consumed the lowest ranks of eunuch servants. It was, the officials assured him, an honor that reflected his intelligence and adaptability. But as Liu Wei soon discovered, the Imperial Archives were far from the scholarly sanctuary he had imagined. The vast underground chambers beneath the Forbidden City housed not just historical documents, but the darkest secrets of the Qing Dynasty, records that revealed the true scope of the system he had been absorbed into. His job was to maintain these documents, to catalog new arrivals, and most disturbingly, to help destroy evidence when certain information became too dangerous for the imperial household to preserve. The head archivist was a man named Wu Changming, a eunuch who had served in the palace for over 40 years and whose body bore the accumulated damage of decades in imperial service. His spine had curved from years of hunching over documents, his fingers were permanently stained with ink, and his eyes had the milky quality of someone who had spent too many hours reading by candlelight. But it was his voice that truly marked him as a creature of the palace system. The high, breathy tone of a man castrated before puberty, but with an edge of authority that came from surviving longer than most of his contemporaries. Wu Changming's first lesson for Liu Wei had nothing to do with filing systems or document preservation. Instead, he led the new arrival deep into the archives, past rows of wooden shelves filled with imperial correspondence, tax records, and military reports. They descended narrow stone steps that seemed to lead into the very heart of the earth, finally stopping in a chamber so deep that the sound of the palace above was completely muffled. Here, Wu Changming explained, were kept the records that the dynasty preferred to forget. Documents detailing the true numbers of eunuchs who had died during castration procedures, figures far higher than the 1 in 3 mortality rate that was publicly acknowledged. Medical reports describing the long-term health consequences of castration that palace physicians had been ordered never to discuss. Letters from families begging for news of sons who had disappeared into palace service and were never heard from again. Most disturbing of all were the detailed accounts of what palace officials euphemistically called special services, the sexual abuse that young eunuchs endured at the hands of both imperial family members and high-ranking court officials. These documents revealed that castration, rather than eliminating sexual exploitation, had simply redirected it into forms that were considered less threatening to imperial bloodlines, but equally destructive to the boys who experienced them. Liu Wei learned that his own castration had been just the beginning of a transformation designed to make him useful for purposes far beyond simple domestic service. The palace maintained a complex hierarchy of sexual exploitation that took advantage of eunuchs' unique position as men who could not threaten imperial succession, but who retained enough masculine characteristics to satisfy certain preferences among the court elite. Young eunuchs like Liu Wei were particularly vulnerable during their first years of service, when their bodies were still adapting to the hormonal changes caused by castration, and their psychological defenses had not yet fully developed. Wu Changming showed him records of boys who had been passed between various court officials like valuable objects, used for entertainment at private gatherings, and discarded when they grew too old or too damaged to maintain their appeal. The documents revealed a systematic approach to this exploitation that was as carefully organized as any other aspect of palace administration. Certain eunuchs were designated as procurers, responsible for identifying new arrivals who showed the physical characteristics or personality traits that particular officials preferred. These procurers received rewards for their services: better living conditions, access to palace luxuries, protection from the worst forms of abuse, creating a system where the victims became complicit in victimizing others. Liu Wei discovered that his assignment to the archives was not the result of his intelligence or adaptability, as he had been told, but because Wu Changming had specifically requested him based on his appearance and demeanor. The head archivist had survived 4 decades in palace service by learning to anticipate the needs and desires of his superiors, and he had identified Liu Wei as someone who could serve multiple functions within the complex ecosystem of imperial exploitation. The work in the archives provided Liu Wei with a unique perspective on the true scope of the eunuch system. Every document he filed, every record he maintained, every report he helped destroy revealed new aspects of the machinery that had consumed him. He learned that the palace employed thousands of eunuchs in various capacities, from kitchen servants to senior administrators, and that the turnover rate was staggering. Most eunuchs died within their first decade of service, victims of disease, abuse, suicide, or simply the accumulated stress of living as incomplete human beings in an environment designed to exploit their vulnerability. The medical records were particularly documenting health problems that were direct consequences of prepubescent castration, but were never publicly acknowledged. Many eunuchs developed severe osteoporosis as they aged, their bones becoming so brittle that simple falls could result in fractures that never properly healed. Others suffered from chronic urinary tract infections caused by the crude surgical techniques used in their castration, leading to painful conditions that made basic bodily functions excruciating ordeals. The psychological documentation was even more disturbing. Palace physicians had conducted what amounted to experiments on their eunuch population, studying the effects of castration on mental development, emotional stability, and social behavior. These studies revealed that many eunuchs developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and dissociative conditions that allowed them to survive abuse by mentally disconnecting from their physical experiences. Liu Wei began to understand that the palace's preference for eunuch servants went far beyond concerns about protecting imperial bloodlines. The castration process created men who were psychologically dependent on the system that had mutilated them, unable to form normal relationships outside the palace walls, and willing to accept treatment that whole men would never tolerate. They were the perfect servants not because they were trustworthy, but because they had nowhere else to go. The archives also contained extensive correspondence between the palace and the knife men who performed castrations throughout the empire. These letters revealed the true economics of the eunuch trade, a vast network of entrepreneurs who had built profitable businesses around the systematic mutilation of children. The knife men maintained detailed records of their clients, noting which families had proven willing to sell sons and which regions produced boys with the physical characteristics that palace officials preferred. More horrifying still were the letters discussing improvements to the castration. Palace officials regularly consulted with knife men about techniques for reducing mortality rates, not out of humanitarian concern, but because dead boys represented lost investments. They experimented with different surgical approaches, various methods of wound treatment, and alternative timing for the procedures, all in service of creating a more efficient system for producing eunuch servants. Liu Wei discovered that some knife men had developed specializations within their gruesome trade. Certain practitioners focused on very young boys, believing that earlier castration produced more docile and psychologically malleable servants. Others specialized in older children who were more likely to survive the procedure, but retained more of their original personalities. The most skilled knife men commanded premium prices for their services and maintained waiting lists of families eager to sell their sons. The correspondence revealed that the palace actively encouraged this trade through a system of quality incentives and bulk purchasing agreements. Knife men who consistently delivered healthy, well-prepared eunuch candidates received bonuses and preferential treatment in future transactions. The palace also provided advance payments to knife men who could guarantee delivery of specific numbers of castrated boys by certain dates, treating the production of eunuchs like any other form of manufacturing. As Liu Wei spent more time in the archives, he began to notice patterns in the documents that revealed the cyclical nature of the eunuch system. Periods of political instability or economic hardship invariably led to increases in the number of families willing to sell sons for castration. Wars, natural disasters, and tax increases all contributed to spikes in the supply of boys available for palace service. The imperial administration had learned to anticipate these cycles and plan their eunuch recruitment accordingly. The palace also maintained detailed genealogical records of their eunuch population, tracking the family origins of their servants with the same care they devoted to imperial bloodlines. These records revealed that certain regions and ethnic groups were considered particularly suitable sources of eunuch candidates, leading to systematic targeting of specific communities by knife men and their agents. Liu Wei learned that his own village had been identified as a promising source of eunuch candidates several years before his family's crisis had made his sale necessary. Agents working for various knife men had been monitoring local conditions, waiting for the right combination of economic desperation and family vulnerability that would make parents willing to consider selling their children. The most disturbing aspect of these genealogical records was their revelation that the palace sometimes actively created the conditions that led to increased eunuch recruitment. Tax assessments could be adjusted to create financial pressure on specific families or regions. Trade restrictions could be imposed to damage local economies and increase desperation. Natural disasters were allowed to worsen through delayed or inadequate relief efforts, knowing that the resulting suffering would drive more families to sell their sons. Wu Changming explained these revelations to Liu Wei with the detached tone of someone who had long ago learned to view horror as simply another administrative detail. The head archivist had survived by developing an encyclopedic knowledge of the palace's darkest secrets and using that knowledge to make himself indispensable to officials who preferred that certain information remain buried. His position gave him power, but it was the power of someone who had traded his humanity for survival in a system designed to destroy both. The relationship between Wu Changming and Liu Wei evolved into something that was part mentorship, part exploitation, and part mutual dependence. The older eunuch taught his young assistant not just how to maintain the archives, but how to survive in a world where knowledge was both weapon and shield. Liu Wei learned which officials could be trusted with certain types of information, which documents were too dangerous to preserve, and which secrets were valuable enough to trade for protection or privilege. But this education came at a price that Liu Wei was only beginning to understand. Wu Changming's lessons weren't just about archival work, they were about becoming complicit in the system that had destroyed them both. Every document Liu Wei helped to conceal or destroy made him a participant in covering up crimes against children like himself. Every secret he learned bound him more tightly to a palace hierarchy that saw him as valuable only as long as he remained useful and silent. The true horror of the eunuch system wasn't just the physical mutilation or even the sexual exploitation. It was the way it transformed victims into accomplices, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse where each generation of castrated boys learned to participate in victimizing the next. Wu Changming had survived for 4 decades by mastering this transformation, and now he was teaching Liu Wei to follow the same path. As winter approached and Liu Wei completed his first year in the archives, he faced the same choice that had confronted every eunuch before him: resist the system and face destruction, or embrace it and become one of its agents. The documents surrounding him in those underground chambers told the stories of boys who had made both choices, and the outcomes were rarely what anyone would call hopeful. The shadows in the Imperial Archives held secrets that went deeper than individual suffering. They contained the blueprint for a machine designed to consume children and produce the perfect servants through systematic dehumanization. Liu Wei was beginning to understand that his castration had been just the first step in a process that would either break him completely or transform him into something he might no longer recognize as human. The final transformation came not through a single moment of revelation, but through the slow erosion of hope that characterized every eunuch's journey from victim to accomplice. Liu Wei's second winter in the archives brought new assignments that would test whether he had truly accepted his place in the imperial machine or still harbored dangerous attachments to his former humanity. Wu Changming began entrusting him with what he called special collections, documents that required more than simple filing or preservation. These were the records that palace officials needed to disappear entirely, burned in the archive's hidden furnaces until nothing remained but ash and memory. Liu Wei's first assignment was to destroy a collection of letters from families inquiring about sons who had vanished into palace service years earlier. As he fed each desperate plea into the flames, Liu Wei felt something inside himself die. These were letters from parents like his own, written by people who still believed their children might return home someday. The mother's handwriting grew increasingly shaky with each unanswered inquiry. The father's formal language barely concealed their growing desperation. Children asked about brothers they hadn't seen in years, wondering if they would ever play together again. But the most heartbreaking were the letters that stopped coming. The final messages that marked the moment when families gave up hope and accepted that their sons were lost forever. Wu Changming watched Liu Wei's face carefully as he burned these documents, evaluating whether the young man had developed the emotional numbness necessary for long-term survival in the archives. The test was more than administrative. It was psychological warfare designed to complete Liu Wei's transformation from victim to collaborator. Every letter he destroyed made him complicit in the system's cruelty. Every family's pain he helped to erase bound him more tightly to the palace hierarchy that depended on such erasures to maintain its legitimacy. By spring, Liu Wei had learned to perform these duties with the same mechanical precision that characterized all eunuch behavior. His hands no longer trembled as he fed documents into the flames. His face remained impassive as he read the desperate words of people whose children had been consumed by the same machine that had claimed him. He had mastered the art of emotional disconnection that allowed palace servants to participate in their own dehumanization without going insane. Wu Changming recognized the completion of this transformation and rewarded Liu Wei with new privileges, better food, warmer clothing, access to rare books that made the long hours in the underground chambers more tolerable. But these rewards came with the understanding that Liu Wei had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He was no longer just a victim of the eunuch system. He had become one of its guardians. The final horror was realizing that this transformation felt like relief. The psychological burden of maintaining his original identity while serving the system that had destroyed it had been exhausting. Embracing his role as an accomplice eliminated the internal conflict that had tormented him for months. He could finally stop mourning the boy he had been and accept the creature he had become. Wu Changming's ultimate lesson came in the form of a single document, a report detailing the planned expansion of eunuch recruitment to include younger children and more efficient castration techniques. The palace had decided that the current system, brutal as it was, wasn't producing servants quickly enough to meet growing demand. They wanted Liu Wei to help identify which records needed to be preserved to support this expansion, and which should be destroyed to prevent future investigators from understanding the true scope of what was being planned. As Liu Wei read through the clinical language describing new methods for mutilating children, he felt nothing. The capacity for horror had been systematically extracted from him, replaced by the cold calculation necessary for survival in a world that measured human worth in terms of administrative efficiency. He had become exactly what the system needed him to become. A victim so thoroughly broken that he could participate in creating new victims without recognizing the moral catastrophe of his actions. The boy who had been dragged screaming into that building years earlier was truly dead now, replaced by something that wore his face but served masters who would have terrified his original self. Liu Wei had learned to find meaning in his survival, purpose in his service, and even a twisted form of pride in his ability to navigate the palace's treacherous hierarchies. This was the ultimate secret of the Qing Dynasty Eunuchs. Not just that they were castrated, abused, and exploited, but that they were systematically transformed into willing participants in their own destruction. The palace had perfected a machine for converting children into accomplices, creating a self-sustaining system of horror that could operate for centuries without requiring external intervention. The true victims weren't just the boys who died on knife men's tables or the young men who suffered abuse in palace chambers. The real tragedy was the complete destruction of human conscience that allowed the system to perpetuate itself through the willing cooperation of those it had already consumed. The eunuchs of the Qing dynasty became not just servants to imperial power, but guardians of the very secrets that revealed the monstrous nature of their own creation. In the shadows of the Forbidden City, surrounded by documents that chronicled centuries of systematic child abuse, Liu Wei had found his place in the world. It was a place built on the graves of innocence, maintained through the silence of survivors and justified by the terrible logic that transforms victims into monsters when survival demands the abandonment of everything that once made them human. The screams that had echoed from that building so many years ago had finally stopped. Not because the suffering had ended, but because the boy who had been capable of screaming no longer existed.